¿Qué tal amigos? ¿Cómo están ustedes? Bienvenidos nuevamente al canal de Venezuela News y Verdades sin Fronteras. El día de hoy vamos a hablar sobre Nancy Pelosi. La destruyeron por completo. Le hicieron así a Nancy Pelosi en temas de politología, donde le dijeron la verdad en la cara y Nancy Pelosi no le gustó. Resulta que participó en un debate de estudiantes de ciencias políticas en la Universidad de Oxford, Inglaterra. Resulta que Winston Marshall, que lo van a ver en unos minutos, del Reino Unido, le da a Nancy Pelosi una paliza adecuada en el Oxford Union sobre lo que es el populismo y quiénes son las verdaderas personas que controlan el mundo y por qué tiene que cambiar. Denuncia la demencia de Joe Biden. La desagradable Nancy finalmente recibe la humillación pública que se merece. Sí, amigos. Citizen Free Press ha publicado lo siguiente. Esto es extraordinario. Nancy Pelosi entra al debate sobre la unión de Oxford y recibe una paliza populista de Winston Marshall. Vamos a saber quién es Winston Marshall. Es un músico, como pueden ver aquí en pantalla, y también es un exjugador de banjo de la banda Oxford. También es un anfitrión del podcast para El Espectador y estudia lo que tiene que ver con ciencias políticas, politología, todo lo que tiene que ver con la rama de la política. Entonces, Nancy Pelosi estuvo presente en uno de los debates muy populares que se hace en la Universidad de Oxford en temas generales, pero de la política. Resulta que la mujer, señores, se convirtió de ser una persona civil a una bruja con una escoba. Cuando le mencionaron el tema del 6 de enero, cuando dijeron que lo del 6 de enero no fue una insurrección, la hubiesen visto, que voy a mostrarles el video, y donde el músico y también politólogo habló sobre la élite, la mujer se convirtió. Entonces, este video estará bastante interesante. Te pido que permanezcas hasta el final y puedas leer detenidamente lo que vas a ver a continuación porque está bastante bueno. Entonces, espero que disfruten el video que te voy a mostrar a continuación de cómo Nancy Pelosi recibe una paliza de la verdad que tanto a ellos que lo merecen, pero no les gusta escuchar lo que no quieren escuchar. Porque es la verdad, pero no lo quieren escuchar. Miren esto, amigos.
Populism is not a threat to democracy. Populism is democracy.
I now look to Mr. Winston Marshall to close the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, words have a tendency to change meaning. When I was a boy, woman meant someone who didn't have a... Populism has become a word used synonymously with racist, we've heard ethno-nationalist, with bigot, with hillbilly, redneck, with deplorables. Elites use it to show their contempt for ordinary people. This is a recent change. Not long ago, Barack Obama, while still president at the North America's Leaders Summit in June 2016, he took umbrage with the notion that Trump be called a populist. How could Trump be called a populist? He doesn't care about working people. If anything, Obama argued, he was the populist. If anything, Obama argued, Bernie was the populist. It was Bernie who'd spent 5 decades fighting for working people. But Trump. Something curious happens. If you watch Obama's speeches after that point, more and more recently, he uses the word populist interchangeably with strongman, with authoritarian. The word changes meaning. It becomes a negative, a pejorative, a slur. To me, Populism is not a dirty word. Since the 2008 crash, and specifically the trillion-dollar Wall Street bailout, we are in the populist age. And for good reason. The elites have failed. Let me address some common fallacies, some of which have been made tonight. If the motion was that demagoguery was a threat to democracy, I would be on that side of the House. If the motion was that political violence was a threat to democracy, I'd be on that side of the House. January 6th has been mentioned. A dark day for America indeed. And I'm sure Congresswoman Pelosi will agree that the entire month of June 2020, when the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon was under siege and under insurrection by radical progressives, those too were dark days for America. Yes?
There is no equivalence of it. So that, yes.
So you don't agree? That's fine, you don't agree, that's fine.
But it is not like what happened on January 6th, which was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States.
So you don't agree? But you'll condemn those days. My point, though, is that all political movements are susceptible to violence and indeed insurrection. And if we were arguing that fascism was a threat to democracy, I'd be on that side of the House. Indeed, the current populist age is a movement against fascism. I've got quite a lot to get through. Populism, as you know, is the politics of the ordinary people against an elite. Populism is not a threat to democracy. Populism is democracy. And why else have universal suffrage if not to keep elites in check? Ladies and gentlemen, given the success of Trump, and more recently Javier Milei taking a chainsaw to the state behemoth of Argentina's bureaucratic monster, you'd be mistaken for thinking this was a right-wing populist age. But that would be ignoring Occupy Wall Street. That would be ignoring Jeremy Corbyn's for the many, not the few. That would be ignoring Bernie against the billionaires, RFK Jr. against Big Pharma, and more recently, George Galloway against his better judgment. Now, all of them, including Galloway, recognize genuine concerns of ordinary people being otherwise ignored by the establishment. I'm actually rather surprised that our esteemed opposition, Congressman Pelosi, is on that side of the motion. I thought the left was supposed to be anti-elite. I thought the left was supposed to be anti-establishment. Today, particularly in America, the globalist left have become the establishment. I suppose for Ms. Pelosi to have taken this side of the motion, she'd be arguing herself out of a job. But it's here in Britain where right and left populists united for the supreme act of democracy, Brexit. Polls have showed the number one reason people voted for Brexit was sovereignty, for more democracy.
Point of information.
Thank you. What was the response of the Brussels elite? They did everything in their power to undermine the democratic will of the British people, and the Westminster elite were just as disgraceful. As we've heard, David Cameron called the voters fruitcakes, loonies, and closet racists. The Liberal Democrats did everything they could to overturn a democratic vote. Keir Starmer campaigned for a second referendum. Elites would have had us voting and voting and voting until we voted their way. Indeed, that's what happened in Ireland and in Denmark. Let's look at some of the other populist movements. The Hong Konger populist revolt is literally called the pro-democracy movement. The farmer revolts from Netherlands to Germany, France, Greece to Sri Lanka Farmers are taking their tractors to the road to protest ESG policy that's floated down to us from those all-knowing, infallible elites of Davos. The trucker movement in Canada became anti-elitist when petty tyrant Prime Minister Justin Trudeau froze their bank accounts, not the behavior of a democratic head of state. The Gilets jaunes in France, ULEZ in London, working people protesting policy that hurt them. And how are they treated? They're called conspiracy theorists. They're called far right by the mayor as well. Ladies and gentlemen, populism is the voice of the voiceless. The real threat to democracy is from the elites. Now, don't get me wrong. We need elites. If President Biden has shown us anything, we need someone to run the countries. When the president has severe dementia, it's not just America that crumbles, the whole world burns. But let's examine the elites. European corporations spend over 1 billion euros a year lobbying Brussels. US corporations spend over $2 billion a year lobbying in DC. 2/3 of Congress receive funding from pharmaceutical companies. Pfizer alone spent $11 million in 2021. They made over $10 billion in profit. No wonder then that 66% of Americans think the economy is rigged against them for the rich and the powerful. And by the way, we used to have a word for when big business and big government were in cahoots. And I think any students here of early 20th century Italian history know what I'm talking about. What about big tech? Throughout the pandemic, Biden's team, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security colluded with big tech in censoring dissenting voices, not kooky conspiracy theorists. People like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, the Stanford epidemiologist. People like Harvard scientist Martin Kulldorff. People spreading true information, not misinformation, true information at odds with the government narrative. Need I remind you, democracy without free speech is not democracy. This was a direct breach, by the way, of the First Amendment. Before COVID, intelligence services colluded with big tech to have Trump suspended off Twitter. Yes, the same platform which hosted the Taliban and Ayatollah deaf to Israel Khomeini, they thought the president crossed the line when he tweeted on Jan 6th, quote, "Remain peaceful, no violence, respect the law and our great men and women in blue." That's a quote. You may be thinking now that Trump is a populist. You are right. He didn't accept the 2020 elections, and he should have. So should Hillary in 2016, so should Brussels, and so should Westminster in 2016, and so too should Congresswoman Pelosi, instead of saying the 2016 election was, quote, hijacked. Quote, hijacked. Thank you.
We don't accept the results of it.
Okay. What about the mainstream media? Let me read you some mainstream media headlines. The New Yorker, the day before the 2016 election. The case against democracy. The Washington Post, the day after the election. The problem with our government is democracy. The LA Times, June 2017. The British election is a reminder of the perils of too much democracy. Vox, June 2017. The two eminent political scientists say the problem with democracy is voters. New York Times, June 2017. The problem with participatory democracy is the participants. Mainstream media elites are part of a class who don't just disdain populism, they disdain the people. If the Democrats had put half their energy into delivering for the people, Trump wouldn't even have a chance in 2024. He shouldn't have a chance. You've had power for 4 years. From the fabricated Steele dossier to trying to take him off the ballot in both Maine and Colorado, the Democrats are the anti-Democrat party. All we need now is the Republicans to come out as the pro-monarchist party. Ladies and gentlemen, populism is not a threat to democracy, but I'll tell you what is. It's elites ordering social media to censor political opponents. It's police shutting down dissenters, be it anti-monarchists in this country or gender-critical voices here, or last week in Brussels, the National Conservative movement. I'll tell you what is a threat to democracy. It's Brussels, DC, Westminster, the mainstream media, big tech, big pharma, corporate collusion, and the Davos cronies. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off ordinary people as deplorable. The threat to democracy comes from those who smear working people as racists. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off working people as populists. And I'll say one last thing. This populist age can be brought to an end at the snap of a finger. All that needs to be done is for elites to start listening to, respecting, and, God forbid, working for ordinary people. Thank you.